Welcome to the hunt. Because this familiar Washington Bicentennial Quarter may look ordinary, but a closer inspection can reveal details that separate everyday pocket change from a seriously collectible coin. Step 1. A 1967 Washington Quarter can look almost completely ordinary at first glance, yet this particular year sits at one of the most important turning points in modern American coinage. It was produced during the nationwide coin shortage that followed the removal of silver from circulating U.S. quarters. And although more than 1 billion examples were struck, truly exceptional pieces are far harder to find than the enormous mintage number suggests. The difference between an ordinary circulated quarter and a remarkable collector specimen can come down to tiny details: surface preservation, strike quality, the type of production, a recognized die variety, or an unusual mint error. Later in this story, we will examine what authenticated examples have actually brought in the marketplace, and why some 1967 quarters can move into the thousands of dollars while ordinary pieces remain common. The important point is that the date alone does not create rarity. The real story begins with what happened inside the United States Mint in the middle of the 1960s, when America's familiar silver quarter was being transformed into the copper-nickel-clad coin that collectors recognize today. By 1967, the United States was dealing with a serious shortage of circulating coins. Rising demand, changing economic conditions, and heavy public use had placed enormous pressure on the nation's coinage system, while silver prices and the increasing intrinsic value of silver coins created additional complications. The Coinage Act of 1965 authorized a fundamental change. The traditional 90% silver composition of the dime and quarter was replaced by copper-nickel-clad metal, while the half-dollar received a reduced silver content. The transition did not happen in isolation. The mint was trying to manufacture billions of coins quickly enough to keep commerce functioning, and 1967 became one of the most productive years in the history of U.S. fractional coinage. The Washington Quarter alone reached a reported total of 1,524,030,1848 circulation strikes. Philadelphia accounted for 873,524,000. Denver produced 632,767,848, and San Francisco contributed 17,740,000. Yet there is an unusual twist. Collectors cannot identify those facilities simply by looking for a mint mark. To discourage coin hoarding during the 1965–1967 shortage period, circulating coins were deliberately struck without mint marks. That means a 1967 quarter with no mint mark is not automatically a Philadelphia coin. The absence of the mint mark was intentional across the circulating production of the period. The physical specifications tell another part of the story. A standard 1967 Washington quarter measures approximately 24.3 millimeters across and weighs 5.67 grams. Instead of the old silver composition, it consists of an outer layer containing 75% copper and 25% nickel bonded to a pure copper core. That layered construction is what gives the coin its distinctive clad appearance, particularly when viewed along the edge. The edge itself is reeded, a feature inherited from earlier quarters and useful both as a traditional design element and as a practical security characteristic. The obverse carries John Flanagan's portrait of George Washington, with the familiar inscriptions "Liberty," "In God We Trust," and the date 1967. On the reverse is the American eagle above a symbolic bundle of arrows, surrounded by United States of America and EPLURIBUS UNUM, with the denomination 1/4 below. The design had already been familiar to Americans for decades by this point, but the metal underneath Washington's portrait had changed dramatically. That contrast is one reason the 1967 quarter deserves more attention than its face value suggests. Visually, it belongs to the classic Washington Quarter era, while metallurgically it represents the beginning of a completely new chapter in everyday American money. Production conditions also explain why the finest surviving 1967 quarters are much more interesting than the gigantic mintage might imply. More than 1.5 billion circulation strikes sounds like an unlimited supply, but most coins were made for commerce, not for collectors. They were transported in bulk, counted, bagged, distributed to banks, and eventually pushed through millions of transactions. Every stage created opportunities for contact marks, scratches, abrasions, dulling, and other damage. The mint also did not issue conventional uncirculated coin sets in 1967. Those sets had been discontinued after 1964 and would not return until 1968. As a result, collectors did not receive the same steady supply of specially preserved annual circulation strikes that might otherwise have been saved from day one. This creates an important distinction between survival and availability. A coin can have been produced in enormous numbers and still become difficult to locate in genuinely outstanding condition. PCGS notes that ordinary circulated 1967 quarters are not generally scarce from a numismatic standpoint, while high-grade mint state pieces are the area where collectors encounter significantly more difficulty. That is why the word rare should never be applied to every 1967 quarter. The date is plentiful. Exceptional preservation is the scarce commodity. The grading question is where the potential collector value begins to separate dramatically. A circulated 1967 quarter can show wear across Washington's hair, cheek, jaw, and the eagle's feathers, and those contact points tell the story of how long the coin remained in everyday use. Once a coin reaches mint state, however, graders are evaluating a completely different set of characteristics. MS60 through MS70 represents coins without wear from circulation, but that does not mean every mint state coin is equally attractive. Marks, abrasions, luster, strike sharpness, and overall eye appeal can push a piece into a much higher or lower grade. MS65 and MS66 examples can be attractive, but MS67 and above become much more demanding because tiny imperfections that would be insignificant on an ordinary coin can prevent a higher grade. PCGS identifies MS68 as the current top certified grade for the regular 1967 circulation strike, and its recorded auction history includes an MS68 example that realized $8,813 at Heritage Auctions in January 2017. That extraordinary result should not be interpreted as the value of every 1967 quarter. It represents a highly certified, unusually high-grade example in a very competitive section of the population. In practical collecting, a hypothetical certified coin in a premium MS67 plus grade might enter a four-figure conversation, perhaps around $1,300 to $2. 400 depending on the market and eye appeal, while an ordinary circulated specimen would be nowhere near that level. There is another layer to the 1967 story that can completely change how the coin is classified: special mint sets. During the 1965-1967 period, the mint did not produce traditional proof sets, but it did issue special mint sets containing specially prepared coins. The 1967 SMS quarter was struck in the same basic clad composition and dimensions as the regular quarter, yet its production and surface characteristics distinguish it from a normal business strike. PCGS records roughly 1.8 million 1967 SMS quarters and separates them into regular SMS, cameo, and deep cameo classifications. The surfaces can be noticeably more reflective, with stronger contrast between the devices and fields on the best examples. This is particularly important because a collector who sees a shiny 1967 quarter may assume it is simply an unusually nice circulation strike, while a specialist may recognize characteristics associated with special mint set production. The distinction becomes even more valuable when the coin possesses exceptional preservation and cameo or deep cameo contrast. A 1967 SMS cameo example, graded SB69, CAM has an authenticated heritage auction record of $4,700, while a deep cameo example graded SB68 DCAM has a recorded result of $4,465. Those numbers demonstrate why identifying the correct production type matters just as much as looking at the date. Varieties and errors provide another route into the serious collector market, but this is an area where caution is essential. The 1967 SMS quarter is documented with recognized double-die varieties, including the FS1, a one double-die obverse, and FS8, a one double-die reverse, with cameo and deep cameo versions also cataloged. A genuine doubled die is not the same thing as ordinary machine doubling, die deterioration, scratches, or damage that happens after the coin leaves the mint. The difference can be subtle enough that photographs alone may lead inexperienced collectors in the wrong direction. Other dramatic errors can be even more valuable, but they must be authenticated because spectacular-looking alterations are frequently manufactured outside the mint. PCGS has documented an unusual two-tailed quarter believed to have been struck during the 1965–1967 period, noting that genuine pieces of this type are exceedingly rare, while most two-tailed coins encountered by the public are fabricated, magician's coins. This is exactly why an unusual 1967 quarter should not be assigned a huge value simply because something looks strange. A legitimate mint error has to make sense technically, show characteristics consistent with the minting process, and ideally receive certification from a respected grading and authentication service. Color and surface appearance require a different kind of understanding because the 1967 quarter is a copper-nickel-clad coin rather than a bronze Lincoln cent. Collectors sometimes use words such as silver, golden, rainbow, gray, or brown to describe tunning, but these visual descriptions should not be confused with the formal red, red-brown, and brown designations commonly associated with copper cents. A 1967 quarter can develop attractive natural tunning from storage conditions, while another may develop unattractive discoloration from environmental exposure, chemicals, improper cleaning, or contamination. Original mint luster is particularly important in high-grade examples. Cleaning can leave hairlines or unnatural brightness that permanently damages the coin's desirability, even when the date and design remain perfectly visible. Storage should therefore be conservative. Keep the coin in an inert, protective holder, avoid PVC-containing materials, minimize handling, and never rub the surfaces with cloth or polish. If the coin appears exceptional, handling it only by the edges helps preserve the surfaces that a professional grader will eventually examine. In a market where a single grade point can make a major financial difference, preservation is not cosmetic. It is part of the coin's economic identity. Authentication becomes especially important once a supposed 1967 rarity starts entering the four-figure range. A serious evaluation begins with basic measurements and visual examination, including diameter, weight, edge construction, surface texture, lettering, design details, and the relationship between the coin's components. A genuine 1967 quarter should conform closely to the established specifications, although minor tolerances can naturally occur during production. Magnification can help identify double die characteristics, die markers, unusual die cracks, strike anomalies, or suspicious tooling. For valuable pieces, professional certification from an established third-party grading service provides an additional layer of confidence because the coin is authenticated, encapsulated, and assigned a standardized grade. This matters particularly when online listings use phrases such as rare error, missing mint mark, or silver-looking 1967 quarter. The missing mint mark itself is not an error on this date. It was intentional. Likewise, a bright appearance does not prove that the coin is a precious metal issue. If someone offered an ordinary-looking 1967 quarter for a surprisingly large sum based solely on its date, skepticism would be appropriate. A genuine premium has to be supported by something concrete: exceptional grade, recognized variety, authentic mint error, special mint set status, or a combination of these factors. The auction record shows just how wide the gap can become between an ordinary coin and an elite example. The regular strike 1967 quarter has reached $8,813 in an authenticated PCGS MS68 sale, while a PCGS MS67 Plus has appeared in documented transactions ranging from several $100s to $850 in the examples listed by Coin Facts. Special mint set pieces create another fascinating tier. A normal SMS SB69 has a recorded result of $610, but the market becomes dramatically stronger when exceptional cameo or deep cameo contrast enters the equation, with documented auction records of $4,700 for SB69 CAM and $4,465 for SB68 DCAM. These results are useful because they demonstrate the central rule of numismatics. The market does not price the date in isolation. It prices the specific coin. A hypothetical collector market example, in a particularly attractive certified high grade, might reasonably be discussed around $1,700 or $2,800, while a rare, exceptionally preserved SMS variety could push considerably higher. But these figures are illustrations of how condition and classification influence demand, not guarantees for any coin sitting in a collection or pocket. Auction prices can change with competition, timing, certification, provenance, and the availability of comparable pieces. Ultimately, the 1967 Washington Quarter is valuable as a collecting subject precisely because its story is more complicated than its enormous mintage suggests. Most examples are ordinary clad quarters created to solve a national coin shortage, and the majority will not command extraordinary premiums. The serious opportunities begin when the coin moves away from the ordinary. An unusually clean regular strike, a top-level mint state grade, a genuine special mint set example, a strong cameo or deep cameo specimen, a documented double die, or a truly authenticated mint error. A coin that looks nearly perfect under casual inspection may still fall short under professional grading, while a piece with the right combination of preservation, strike, originality, and recognized rarity can become a much more significant numismatic object. That is why collectors should resist both extremes, neither assuming every 1967 quarter is worthless nor believing every example is secretly worth thousands. The most compelling discoveries are made through careful examination, accurate attribution, proper preservation, and independent authentication. A 1967 quarter may have started life as just 25 cents in an economy desperate for change, but more than half a century later, its surviving condition, production history, and place within the modern Washington Quarter series can determine whether it remains a piece of pocket change or becomes a serious collectible with a documented place in the numismatic marketplace. Step 2. A 1977 Washington Quarter can pass through your fingers without attracting a second glance, yet this seemingly ordinary piece of clad coinage has become a surprisingly interesting target for collectors who understand the difference between a common survivor and an exceptional one. More than 700 million regular strike quarters were produced for circulation that year, so rarity does not come simply from seeing the date 1977 on the obverse. Instead, the real intrigue lies in condition, mint origin, strike quality, surface preservation, varieties, and the possibility of an unusual mint-made error. As we move deeper into the story, the distinction between an everyday 1977 quarter and a truly desirable specimen will become much clearer, and we will examine authenticated auction results that show just how dramatically the market can change when an ordinary coin reaches an extraordinary grade. The most important lesson is that collectors are not simply buying a date, they are competing for the finest surviving examples, and the reasons behind that competition are rooted in the unusual history of American coin production during the 1970s. When the 1977 quarter entered circulation, the United States was already more than a decade into the great transformation of its circulating coinage. The familiar Washington quarter had been struck in 90% silver through 1964, but beginning in 1965, the circulating quarter became copper-nickel clad, with a copper-nickel outer layer bonded to a pure copper center. That change was driven by rising silver prices and the nation's mid-1960s coin shortage, and by 1977, the clad quarter had become completely normal to the American public. The country itself was moving through a complicated period. Inflation was a major economic concern. Energy prices remained influential following the oil crises of the previous decade, and Americans were living through a period of political and social change that included the aftermath of Watergate and the beginning of Jimmy Carter's presidency in January 1977. The quarter was not created to commemorate those events. Its purpose was far more practical. It was everyday money, designed to move through cash registers, banks, vending machines, parking meters, and pockets across the country. That ordinary role is precisely what makes surviving pristine examples so interesting today. Coins intended to be spent were not designed with future preservation in mind. The production figures reveal just how much of this coin entered American commerce. Philadelphia struck 468,556,000 regular 1977 quarters, while Denver produced another 256,524,978, giving the two facilities a combined regular strike output of 725,080,978 pieces. San Francisco separately produced 3,251,152 proof quarters for collectors. The regular Philadelphia issue carries no mint mark, while Denver examples bear the familiar D beneath the portrait area. The San Francisco proof carries an S. This distinction matters because a missing mint mark on a 1977 quarter is not automatically an error. The Philadelphia issue was supposed to be unmarked, while the Denver issue was intentionally identified with its D. Collectors also need to remember that the proof coin is a completely different production category from an ordinary circulation strike. Proofs were manufactured with specially prepared dies and planchets, and were intended for collectors rather than general commerce. The huge production totals for the business strikes explain why an ordinary 1977 quarter is not considered a major rarity, but the numbers alone do not tell us how many survived in exceptional condition. That question becomes much more important once grading enters the picture. Physically, the 1977 Washington quarter follows the specifications established for the clad era. It has a diameter of 24.3 millimeters and a standard weight of 5.67 grams, with a reeded edge. Its composition is 75% copper and 25% nickel over a pure copper center, a layered structure that can be seen most clearly along the edge when the coin is examined carefully. The obverse features George Washington facing left, based on John Flanagan's celebrated design. Around him appear Liberty and In God We Trust, with the date 1977 at the bottom. The reverse presents an American eagle with wings extended, clutching a bundle of arrows, with United States of America above and 1/4 below, while EPLURIBUS appears above the eagle. The arrows symbolize military readiness, while the surrounding imagery reflects the nation's identity and authority. Although the design had been familiar for decades, its survival into the clad era gave it a remarkable visual continuity. The same basic Washington Quarter people knew from earlier generations now existed on a completely different metallic foundation. For collectors, that continuity makes the 1977 issue part of the larger story of how the United States adapted its money without abandoning one of its most recognizable coin designs. The manufacturing process also helps explain why condition is so important. A quarter begins with metal prepared to the required composition and thickness, which is formed into planchets before striking. The planchet is placed between dies that carry the obverse and reverse designs, and enormous pressure forces the metal into the recesses of those dies. On a circulation coin, the goal is efficient mass production rather than the flawless presentation demanded by a modern proof. Once struck, coins are handled, counted, transported, bagged, and distributed in enormous quantities. During that journey, freshly minted quarters can strike against one another, producing small contact marks that may be nearly invisible on an ordinary coin, but become decisive when a grading service examines a piece for MS66 or MS67. Luster is equally important. A strong, original mint sheen can make a coin appear vibrant and undisturbed, while dull or impaired surfaces can indicate wear, mishandling, environmental exposure, or cleaning. The difference between a technically uncirculated quarter and a truly elite mint state specimen can therefore be surprisingly subtle. A coin may have no obvious circulation wear and still lose significant grading potential because of abrasions across Washington's cheek, hair, jaw, or other prominent areas. That is where the population of surviving high-grade coins becomes more important than the original mintage. PCGS describes the 1977 P quarter as common through most grades, but identifies MS66 and higher as the point where scarcity begins to matter. In MS67, the coin becomes difficult to obtain, and PCGS has described examples above that level as essentially unheard of in its published assessment. Its certification data also illustrates how quickly the population narrows as the grade rises. One recorded PCGS MS66 example shows 95 pieces graded higher and 459 lower in the reference certification data, demonstrating that even within a modern issue, the population landscape becomes highly competitive at the upper end. The Denver issue follows a similar pattern, with PCGS characterizing grades below MS66 as common, MS66 as somewhat scarce, and MS67 as a difficult grade with only a few dozen confirmed examples in its cited assessment. This is the paradox of the 1977 quarter. Hundreds of millions were made, but the number of coins that survive with the precise combination of pristine surfaces, strong strike, attractive luster, and minimal contact marks is dramatically smaller. Collectors pursuing registry sets are not competing for just any 1977 quarter. They are looking for one that can stand near the top of the surviving population. Once a coin reaches the upper mint state grades, grading becomes a discipline of tiny differences. MS60 represents an uncirculated coin that may still have significant marks or unattractive surfaces, while progressively higher grades demand stronger overall preservation and eye appeal. At MS65, a coin can be genuinely impressive, but the jump toward MS66 and MS67 requires increasingly clean fields and fewer distracting imperfections. Strike quality also becomes critical because a weakly struck coin may lack the sharp definition that collectors expect from a premium example. For a 1977 quarter, the visual relationship between luster, contact marks, strike, and overall originality can determine whether the coin remains a modest collectible or enters the serious condition rarity market. Color deserves careful treatment as well. Unlike copper cents, where red, red-brown, and brown designations are central to the grading vocabulary, clad Washington quarters are not normally valued through those same color categories. Instead, collectors evaluate the coin's original surfaces, tunning, luster, and eye appeal. Artificially brightened or chemically altered surfaces can be a major negative. A natural-looking coin with intact luster is far more desirable than one that has been polished in an attempt to make it appear newer. This is why experienced collectors examine the coin under controlled lighting, rather than relying on a photograph or a seller's description. The proof version introduces an entirely different collecting experience. San Francisco struck 3,251,152 proof 1977 S Washington quarters, and these pieces were produced specifically for collectors. Proof manufacturing uses specially prepared dies and planchets to create sharper visual contrast and more reflective fields than typical circulation strikes. The finest examples can receive cameo or deep cameo designations when the contrast between frosted devices and mirrored fields is strong enough to qualify. PCGS records a 1977 S deep cameo proof at the PR70 level and lists an auction record of $575 from a heritage auction sale in January 2006. That figure is important not because it makes every 1977 S proof expensive, but because it demonstrates how the market responds to perfection within a defined category. Most 1977 S proofs are not rare, and PCGS describes the issue as fairly common through PR69 Deep Cameo. The challenge is concentrated at the absolute top of the grading scale, where even a microscopic flaw can prevent a perfect grade. A collector comparing a normal circulation strike with a PR70 DCAM proof is therefore comparing two different products created for two different purposes, even though both carry the same date and Washington quarter design. Errors and varieties require even greater caution, because the modern coin market contains many pieces that look unusual without being genuine mint errors. A true error must have occurred during the minting process, and its characteristics should be consistent with how coins are actually produced. Off-center strikes, clips, broad strikes, die cracks, struck through errors, and other recognized minting mistakes can be collectible, but the 1977 quarter should not automatically be assigned a premium simply because lettering looks unusual or a design element appears doubled. Machine doubling, die deterioration, post-mint damage, scratches, and attempts to alter a coin can create appearances that inexperienced collectors mistake for valuable varieties. The established Washington Quarter series does contain numerous documented varieties across other dates, including doubled dies and repunched or over-mintmark varieties, but there is no basis for inventing a spectacular 1977 variety merely because one is claimed online. For a questionable coin, weight, diameter, edge construction, surface texture, and close examination of the suspected anomaly are useful first steps. If the potential value becomes substantial, professional authentication is the safer route. A grading service can determine whether the piece is genuine, whether the feature is mint-made, and how the coin compares with known varieties. This is particularly important when a seller uses dramatic language but provides no certification, attribution, or credible documentation. The documented marketplace provides a useful reality check. The regular 1977 P Washington quarter has a recorded PCGS auction result of $2,550 for an MS67 Plus example sold on April 10, 2021. That is a legitimate high-end result, but it represents an exceptionally graded coin rather than a typical 1977 quarter. The Denver issue has a much lower documented PCGS auction result of $460 for an MS67 example sold in April 2023, illustrating how dramatically mint, grade, population, and buyer competition can affect the market. PCGS has also reported that 1977, 1978, and 1979 Washington quarters can be available in attractive MS65 condition for roughly the low double digits, while the finest grades can show much greater price disparities. These facts are essential because they prevent a common mistake, taking the highest auction number and applying it to every example of the date. A collector who encounters a certified MS-67 plus Philadelphia 1977 quarter might reasonably be looking at a coin in the low thousands range, while an ordinary circulated example would not be remotely comparable. A particularly attractive high-grade piece could bring around $1,400 or $2,300 if the market and certification support it, but those figures should be treated as examples of premium-grade market territory, not guaranteed values. Authentication, grade, originality, eye appeal, population, and timing all influence what a buyer is willing to pay. Preserving a promising 1977 quarter begins with doing less rather than more. Do not polish it, rub it with a cloth, scrape away discoloration, or use household chemicals to make the surfaces appear brighter. Those treatments can permanently damage the original finish and may leave a professional grader with evidence of cleaning or alteration. Handle the coin by its edges, keep it in a quality inert holder, and avoid materials that can react with the metal over long periods. For raw coins, a proper non-PVC flip or archival quality capsule is preferable to loose storage where pieces can strike one another. For a potentially valuable specimen, certification can provide both authentication and physical protection, although grading should be considered carefully because submission fees and the possibility of receiving a lower than expected grade are part of the process. The long-term appeal of the 1977 Washington Quarter is not based on a fantasy that every example is rare. It comes from the fascinating tension between abundance and excellence. Hundreds of millions were made, yet the finest survivors can become genuinely competitive collectibles. A 1977 quarter with ordinary circulation, where remains a historical piece of American pocket change, while an authenticated, sharply struck, exceptionally preserved example can become a condition rarity worthy of serious attention. That distinction is what gives this unassuming clad quarter its lasting place in modern American numismatics. Its value is ultimately determined not by the date alone, but by the exact story told by the metal, the strike, the surfaces, the grade, the authenticity, and the collectors willing to compete for that particular survivor. Step 3. There is a reason an experienced collector might stop mid-search when a 1985 P Washington quarter appears under the light. At first glance, it is almost impossibly ordinary. The familiar portrait of George Washington, the American Eagle, a date from the middle of the 1980s, and a small P identifying Philadelphia. More than 750 million were struck, so nothing about the date alone suggests a major rarity. Yet this is exactly where the investigation becomes interesting. The 1985 P issue has developed an unusual reputation among condition-focused Washington Quarter collectors because genuinely exceptional survivors become scarce at the upper end of the grading scale. The difference can be hidden in microscopic contact marks, the quality of the original luster, the sharpness of the strike, or the preservation of the broad open fields. Later, we will examine authenticated auction results and see why an ordinary-looking quarter can enter a completely different collecting category when it reaches an elite certified grade. But before thinking about value, the first task is to understand what this coin actually is, how it was made, and why so many examples that began life together ended up looking so different decades later. The story begins in Philadelphia in 1985. During a period when American coinage was firmly established in the copper-nickel-clad era. The silver Washington quarter had disappeared from normal production after 1964, as the rising value of silver and the nation's coin shortage pushed the mint toward a less expensive metallic system. By the time this quarter was produced, Americans had spent 2 decades using clad quarters in everyday commerce, and the design itself had become almost invisible through sheer familiarity. The United States economy in 1985 was expanding after the difficult recession of the early 1980s. Inflation had fallen considerably from the levels of the previous decade, and the country was experiencing the economic and political environment of the Reagan administration. The quarter remained a working denomination rather than a commemorative object, moving through grocery stores, vending machines, parking meters, banks, cash drawers, and millions of pockets. That purpose is crucial to the coin's later rarity. The mint was not trying to create pristine collectibles. It was producing enormous quantities of durable currency as efficiently as possible. Every quarter was expected to enter a system of handling that could eventually leave marks on the surfaces. A collector looking at one today is therefore examining the survivor of a long journey that the mint never intended anyone to preserve. The numbers make the paradox even stronger. Philadelphia produced exactly 775,818,962 regular strike Washington quarters in 1985, while the Denver Mint struck 519,962,888. The Philadelphia issue is identified by the absence of a mint mark, although modern collectors often refer to it as the 1985 P for cataloging purposes. The P mint mark itself was not placed on the coin. It is the attribution used to distinguish the Philadelphia production from Denver's demarked issue. San Francisco separately produced collector proofs, meaning a quarter carrying an S belongs to a different production category and should not be confused with this Philadelphia circulation strike. An experienced collector therefore begins with the date and mint identification, but does not stop there. The enormous Philadelphia mintage tells us immediately that the coin is common in ordinary circulated grades. It does not tell us how many survived in exceptional condition. That distinction is the foundation of the entire 1985 P story. When nearly 776 million coins are released into commerce, the market has no reason to pay a substantial premium simply because one is a 1985 P. The premium emerges only when the individual coin demonstrates characteristics that are genuinely scarce among those hundreds of millions of survivors. Now examine the metal and construction as though the quarter were evidence in a numismatic laboratory. The standard 1985 P weighs 5.67 grams, measures 24.3 millimeters in diameter, and has a reeded edge. Its composition is a 75% copper and 25% nickel outer layer bonded over a pure copper center, the familiar clad sandwich that replaced the older silver alloy for regular Washington quarters. The edge can be particularly revealing because it allows the collector to see the copper core between the outer layers. The obverse carries John Flanagan's portrait of George Washington facing left, with Liberty above, In God We Trust to the sides, and the date below. The reverse features the American eagle with wings extended, clutching a bundle of arrows, surrounded by United States of America and EPLURIBUS UNUM, with 1/4 at the bottom. The arrows traditionally communicate strength and readiness, while the eagle serves as a national emblem. There is an interesting artistic continuity here. Although the coin's metal had changed dramatically from the silver quarters of earlier generations, the central visual identity of the denomination remained recognizable. That consistency made the quarter familiar to the public, but for today's collector it also creates a useful baseline. When examining a potentially exceptional specimen, every letter, rim, feather, and contour can be compared against the expected design to determine whether the coin is normal, damaged, weakly struck, or genuinely unusual. Production explains why surface preservation is such a difficult hurdle. A circulation quarter begins as a correctly prepared planchet, which is fed into a press between dies carrying the obverse and reverse designs. Under tremendous pressure, the metal flows into the recessed portions of the dies, creating the raised devices and lettering that define the finished coin. After striking, however, the coin's journey does not end. Newly minted quarters can collide with one another during counting and transportation, producing contact marks before they ever reach a bank. Once released into commerce, they encounter pockets, machines, counters, hard surfaces, and other coins. A single abrasion across Washington's cheek or a noticeable contact mark in an open field may have little significance on a circulated quarter, but it can become decisive when the same coin is being considered for MS-66 or MS-67. This is why an experienced collector does not simply ask whether a coin looks new. They tilt it under light and watch the luster move across the surfaces. Original mint luster should appear integrated with the metal rather than resembling a polished shine. The field should be examined for hairlines, scratches, spots, and contact marks, while the rim should be checked for damage. The reverse deserves equal attention. The eagle's feathers, lettering, and open areas can reveal whether the coin received a strong strike and whether it escaped the rough treatment that most circulation pieces experienced. Once wear has been ruled out, professional grading becomes the next stage of the investigation. The Sheldon scale used by major grading services runs from 1 to 70, with mint state grades applying to coins that show no wear from circulation. But uncirculated is not synonymous with elite. An MS-60 coin can still display numerous marks and unattractive surfaces, while MS-65 requires considerably stronger preservation. At MS-66, the evaluator becomes increasingly unforgiving about small abrasions, and MS-67 represents a very high level of preservation where even minor distractions can matter. The 1985P is a fascinating condition rarity because its enormous mintage does not translate into an enormous supply at the highest grades. PCGS expert commentary states that fewer than a couple hundred examples had been found in MS-66 and higher in its cited assessment, while MS-67 was described as one of the tougher issues in the entire Washington Quarter series, with only a small number known and none graded higher in that assessment. Current population reports can change as additional coins are submitted, so population numbers should always be treated as a moving snapshot rather than an absolute census of every surviving coin. Still, the principle remains powerful. The 1985P is common as a date, but genuinely superb examples are scarce. That is the kind of rarity registry collectors understand, because they are not trying to acquire just any quarter. They are trying to acquire one that occupies an exceptional position among known survivors. This is also where eye appeal starts separating one high-grade coin from another. Two coins may both receive an MS-66 designation, yet one can look dramatically better because of stronger luster, cleaner fields, sharper details, and more attractive overall surfaces. Collectors examine Washington's cheek and jaw, the hair around the portrait, the open field surrounding the inscriptions, and the reverse areas around the eagle and denomination. Strike quality matters because a weak strike can leave details less defined even when the coin has never circulated. Originality matters because cleaning can create unnatural brightness, hairlines, or a lifeless appearance that permanently changes how the coin is evaluated. Color is another area where caution is necessary. The red-brown, and brown designations commonly associated with copper cents are not the normal color classifications used for clad Washington quarters. For this coin, the collector is more concerned with original luster, natural toning, surface originality, and visual balance. A pleasing natural tone can sometimes contribute to eye appeal, while artificial coloration, chemical treatment, or polishing can seriously reduce desirability. These details explain why a quarter that appears flawless to the naked eye may still fail to reach an elite grade. Under professional magnification and controlled lighting, the coin is being judged against the best survivors of the entire issue, not against the average quarter sitting in someone's change jar. Only after the physical examination does the market begin to make sense. PCGS lists an authenticated auction record of $1,528 for a 1985P Washington Quarter graded MS-67, sold by Goldberg Auctioneers on June 5, 2017. That is a particularly important result because it demonstrates exactly how condition rarity can transform a common date. It does not mean that a typical 1985 p quarter is worth anywhere near that amount. In fact, ordinary circulated examples generally remain close to face value, while even many uncirculated examples carry only modest premiums. The four-figure result belongs to an exceptionally graded, certified specimen. More recent market activity also shows how variable high-grade prices can be. Certified MS-67 examples have appeared in documented transactions at several $100s, while other asking prices or private market offers can be substantially different. This is why collectors should distinguish between an auction record, an asking price, and a price guide estimate. They are not interchangeable. A genuinely premium MS-66 could potentially occupy a market range around $1,100 to $1,800 if certification, eye appeal, and scarcity support it, while a top-level MS-67 could command a figure around $1,900 to $3,000 under strong competitive conditions. Those are not guarantees, and they should never be applied to an uncertified coin simply because it looks shiny. The authenticated record is valuable precisely because it tells us what a specific, verified coin actually achieved in a documented transaction. The next question is whether a strange-looking 1985 p quarter represents a genuine mint error or simply damage acquired after leaving Philadelphia. This distinction is one of the most important safeguards in modern coin collecting. A true mint error must originate during production and should display physical characteristics consistent with the minting process. Possible categories across U.S. coinage include off-center strikes, clip planchets, struck-through errors, broad strikes, die cracks, and wrong planchet strikes. But the existence of these categories does not mean every unusual-looking 1985 p quarter belongs to one of them. Machine doubling can resemble a doubled die. Scratches can appear to create extra lettering. Rim damage can look like a striking anomaly. Chemical exposure can alter the surface and make the coin appear to have a missing layer. The collector should therefore weigh the coin, measure it, inspect the edge, compare its design with authenticated examples, and study any suspected error under magnification. There is also a particularly important warning concerning online listings. A seller's description calling a coin rare error is not authentication. If a feature appears significant enough to justify a four-figure valuation, independent examination becomes far more important. Professional certification can establish authenticity, assign a standardized grade, and when appropriate, attribute a recognized variety or error. Without that evidence, the responsible conclusion is simply that the feature is unusual and requires further investigation. That cautious approach protects collectors from paying rarity prices for ordinary damage. Preservation is the final part of the investigation because the very characteristics that make the finest 1985 p quarters desirable can be destroyed surprisingly easily. Never polish the coin, wipe it with a cloth, use household chemicals, or attempt to make the surfaces brighter. A coin that looks more reflective after cleaning may actually be less desirable because the original surface has been disturbed. Handle the piece only by its edges, store it in an inert holder, and avoid PVC-containing materials that can cause long-term surface problems. If the coin is raw and appears unusually clean, photograph it without touching the faces and consider professional evaluation before making any claim about rarity. A certified MS-66 or MS-67 example is protected not only by its holder, but by the documented opinion of an independent grading service. Current collector demand is strongest where condition rarity intersects with set building and registry competition, because the supply of top-grade survivors is far smaller than the original mintage suggests. One authenticated MS-67 example has already demonstrated a documented $1,528 auction result. And exceptional coins can still attract serious attention when collectors compete for the finest available pieces. A high-end specimen might reasonably be discussed in the neighborhood of $2,200 to $3,400 when its grade, certification, originality, eye appeal, and market timing all align, while a lower grade or circulated quarter can remain essentially a face value collectible. The long-term significance of the 1985p is therefore not that millions were made, but that so few appear to have survived in truly outstanding condition. More than 40 years after leaving the Philadelphia Mint, this ordinary piece of clad currency has become a compelling lesson in modern numismatics. Rarity can emerge not from scarcity at birth, but from extraordinary survival. Step 4. The 1776 Washington Bicentennial Quarter is one of those American coins that seems almost too familiar to deserve a second look. Yet its story changes completely when you examine it as a numismatist would. Millions of Americans encountered this unusual quarter during the nation's bicentennial celebration, and countless examples were saved simply because the reverse looked different from the quarters people had known all their lives. But familiarity is not the same thing as rarity. Some examples are common, some are scarce in exceptional condition, some belong to special silver issues, and a small number carry genuine mint-made characteristics that can transform their place in the collecting world. Even the date itself requires a closer look, because this coin does not simply say 1976. It carries the dual date 1776-1976, commemorating 2 centuries of American independence. As we examine the coin piece by piece, we will uncover why collectors separate ordinary bicentennial quarters from truly desirable specimens, how mint, composition, variety, grade, and preservation influence demand, and what authenticated examples have actually achieved in the marketplace. The remarkable part is that the most important clues are sitting in plain sight on the coin itself. To understand why this quarter exists, we have to step into the atmosphere of America approaching its 200th anniversary. The United States Mint was preparing a nationwide numismatic celebration of the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, and Congress had authorized special circulating designs for the quarter, half-dollar, and Eisenhower dollar. Unlike an ordinary annual redesign, the bicentennial program was intended to place a visible piece of the nation's history into everyday commerce. The legislation authorized the special coins beginning in 1975, which produced one of the most unusual circumstances in modern American coinage. Quarters dated 1776-1976 were struck during both 1975 and 1976. There was no separate 1975 dated bicentennial quarter. Instead, the dual date represented the entire 2-century anniversary period. The Mint expected enormous public interest, and the new coins were deliberately made available for ordinary Americans rather than being restricted to collectors. In 1975, the first bicentennial circulating coins were ceremonially introduced, and the quarter's reverse was credited to Jack L.R., whose colonial drummer design had been selected for the denomination. The design captured the spirit of the Revolutionary era without depicting a specific battle or historical individual, turning the quarter into a symbolic snapshot of America's founding struggle. Now look closely at the reverse, because this is where the bicentennial quarter separates itself from every regular Washington quarter surrounding it in a coin album. Instead of the traditional eagle, the reverse shows a colonial drummer facing left, accompanied by a torch and surrounded by 13 stars representing the original 13 colonies. The inscriptions United States of America, EPLURIBUS UNUM, and quarter dollar frame the composition, creating a distinctly revolutionary-era visual language. The drummer is not merely decorative. Drummers were important in 18th-century military life because rhythmic signals helped organize troops and communicate commands on battlefields where verbal instructions could be difficult to hear. The torch adds another layer of symbolism, evoking liberty and the revolutionary ideal, while the 13 stars connect the modern United States directly to its original colonial foundation. On the obverse, however, Americans saw something familiar. John Flanagan's George Washington portrait remained in place, but the normal date was replaced by the unusual 1776 1976 dual date, with Liberty and In God We Trust surrounding the portrait. This combination of familiar and revolutionary imagery was deliberate. The Mint wanted the public to recognize the quarter immediately, while simultaneously understanding that something historically significant was happening. The result was a coin that could function as money and as a miniature national commemoration at the same time. The next clue is found not in the artwork but in the metal. Most bicentennial quarters released for circulation were copper-nickel clad, consisting of a 75% copper and 25% nickel outer layer bonded to a pure copper center. They retained the familiar 5.67-gram weight, approximately 24.3 millimeter diameter, and reeded edge of the modern Washington quarter. But the bicentennial program also brought back a 40% silver version for collectors, produced at San Francisco. That distinction is enormously important because two quarters can look similar at first glance, while belonging to completely different collecting categories. The copper-nickel-clad Philadelphia issue had a mintage of 809,780,4016, while Denver produced 860,118,839 clad pieces. San Francisco produced 11,040% silver uncirculated quarters, along with silver-proof versions, while millions of clad proofs were also made. The silver pieces are not simply valuable because they carry the bicentennial design. Their composition itself gives them a different place in the market. A useful first examination is therefore the mint mark. Philadelphia circulation pieces have no mint mark, Denver pieces carry a D, and San Francisco collector issues carry an S, but the S alone does not prove that a coin is silver. The collector must determine whether the specific piece is clad or 40% silver, because the edge, weight, certification, and provenance can all help establish what is actually in front of them. There is another fascinating complication. The bicentennial quarter was produced during both 1975 and 1976, but the coin itself does not tell you which production year it came from. That means collectors do not normally separate ordinary 1975 and 1976 circulation quarters by simply reading the date, because both carry 1776-1976. The distinction can matter when the coin comes from a documented 1975 mint set or proof set, and specialized catalogs identify such pieces separately. There were also changes in the bicentennial reverse lettering during production. Although the most famous Type 1 and Type 2 discussion applies across the bicentennial denominations, and should not be confused with a claim that every visible lettering difference on a quarter is a major rarity. The later reverse lettering was refined, and collectors who study the series learn to recognize the relevant design types rather than relying on vague descriptions such as thick letters or different font. This is where serious numismatic investigation differs from internet speculation. A real variety has to be attributable to a known die or documented design change. A strange-looking letter, unusual spacing, or apparent doubling may instead be die deterioration. Mechanical doubling, damage, or photography. The safest approach is to compare the coin against established references and, when the potential premium is substantial, have the variety authenticated by a recognized grading service. The enormous production of bicentennial quarters means that the burden of proof is especially important. Unusual does not automatically mean rare. Condition is where the economics become much more interesting. Imagine two 1976D bicentennial quarters sitting under the same lamp. Both have the same drummer, the same dual date, the same composition, and the same mint mark. One has been through decades of circulation, carrying scratches, dullness, flat and high points, and contact marks. The other still displays strong original luster, sharp details, clean fields, and almost no distracting marks. To a casual observer, both are simply old quarters. To a professional grader, they can represent entirely different levels of preservation. Mint state grades begin at MS60, but reaching the upper grades requires increasingly demanding surface quality, strike, luster, and eye appeal. The 1976 D issue is especially interesting because PCGS estimates more than 77 million examples survive in mint state, yet the population becomes much tighter at the finest grades. PCGS records an MS68 auction record of $6,463 for a 1976 D-clad quarter sold by Heritage Auctions in January 2017. That result belongs to an authenticated, extraordinarily high-grade example, not to the millions of ordinary bicentennial quarters found in circulation. In a more typical premium-grade scenario, a certified MS67 example with strong eye appeal might enter a collector discussion around $1,000 to $2,000, while a truly elite coin can move substantially beyond that range when registry collectors compete for it. The important factor is not merely uncirculated. It is how close the individual survivor comes to perfection within its population. The silver bicentennial quarter reveals an entirely different side of the market. San Francisco produced 11,040% silver uncirculated examples, and the composition is 40% silver and 60% copper, giving the coin a weight of approximately 5.75 grams rather than the 5.67 grams associated with the clad versions. These silver pieces were made specifically as collector products, and were not ordinary circulation issues in the same sense as the Philadelphia and Denver clad quarters. PCGS records an extraordinary auction result of $19,200 for a 1976 S silver bicentennial quarter, graded MS69, sold by Heritage Auctions in June 2019. That number can sound startling when compared with the coin's face value, but it must be understood correctly. This was an authenticated, exceptionally high-grade silver example that reached a competitive specialized market. It does not mean that every 1976 S silver bicentennial quarter is remotely worth that amount. In fact, certified silver examples in lower grades can trade for much more modest sums. A hypothetical premium certified silver specimen in a strong but not elite grade might fall into a range around $1,100 to $2,500 depending on silver content, certification, condition, and buyer demand. The great lesson here is that composition creates one layer of rarity, while condition creates another. When those two factors converge at the highest levels, the marketplace can become dramatically more competitive. Proofs and mint errors take the investigation even deeper. San Francisco produced millions of clad proof bicentennial quarters, and the best examples can receive cameo or deep cameo designations when the frosted design elements contrast strongly against mirrored fields. PCGS records a $6,038 auction result for a 1976 S-clad proof, although the remarkable figure came from a dramatic multiple strike error rather than an ordinary proof. In that documented case, the coin was struck 5 times, with later impressions substantially off-center, and it was certified proof 67 by NGC. Other authenticated errors include bicentennial quarters struck on incorrect planchets or showing unusual striking combinations. One 1976 S-clad quarter struck on a 5-cent planchet with strong clashed dies sold for $4,080 at Heritage Auctions in 2021, while another struck on a clad dime planchet with strong clashed dies realized $4,800. These are exactly the kinds of results that create excitement around the series, but they must never be applied to normal coins. A genuine mint error has to be physically consistent with the minting process and independently authenticated. The same caution applies to alleged doubled dies. PCGS documents recognized 1976D double die obverse varieties such as FS1 and FS1 but mechanical doubling and damage can easily fool an inexperienced viewer. A genuine attribution requires comparison with the known variety, not simply seeing what looks like a second outline around a letter. And that leads to the most important lesson in the entire investigation. The more dramatic the claim, the more important the evidence becomes. The next discovery is often not the rarest coin. It is the ability to tell a genuine rarity from an ordinary coin that only looks unusual. Authentication should therefore begin with the basics before any collector starts imagining an auction result. First, verify the dual date and design, then inspect the mint mark, edge, diameter, weight, and overall construction. A clad quarter should have the expected copper-nickel outer layers and copper core, while the 40% silver San Francisco issue should conform to its documented specifications. A suspicious coin can be compared against certified examples for lettering, relief, rim shape, and surface texture. Magnification can reveal whether suspected doubling is actually a known double die characteristic or simply machine doubling. Professional grading adds another level of confidence by combining authentication with standardized condition assessment. Preservation is equally important. A promising bicentennial quarter should never be polished, rubbed, dipped in household chemicals, or cleaned with abrasive materials. Those treatments can destroy original surfaces and reduce collector appeal even if the coin looks brighter afterward. Store valuable examples in inert holders, avoid PVC-containing materials, handle coins by their edges, and keep them away from unnecessary humidity and physical contact. Natural tunning can sometimes be attractive, but artificial color or altered surfaces can become a liability. Color designations such as red, red-brown, and brown are primarily associated with copper coins rather than being the normal grading language for clad Washington quarters. For this series, originality, luster, tunning, surface quality, and eye appeal are much more relevant. A certified high-grade clad example might command around $1,600 to $3,000 when its population position and market demand justify the premium, while a rare authenticated error can enter an entirely different category. The price is never created by the words bicentennial quarter alone. It is created by the exact identity and condition of the coin being offered. The enduring power of the 1976 Washington Bicentennial Quarter comes from the fact that it is simultaneously common American currency, a commemorative artifact, and a surprisingly deep collecting field. More than 800 million clad quarters came from Philadelphia, more than 860 million from Denver, and millions of additional collector pieces emerged from San Francisco. So ordinary examples are not rare simply because they are 50 years old. Yet the series contains multiple collecting paths: clad circulation strikes, proof coins, 40% silver issues, recognized varieties, exceptional condition rarities, and dramatic authenticated mint errors. The market proves how different those categories can become. PCGS lists a $2,520 auction record for the regular Philadelphia clad issue, while the Denver issue has reached $8,400 in its broader auction records, and the silver and major error categories have produced results far beyond the ordinary collector market. Those figures should be read as evidence of exceptional coins and specialized circumstances, not as promises attached to every quarter bearing the bicentennial design. A collector looking at a piece from an old jar should first ask what it is, where it was made, what it is made from, whether it is original, how well it was struck, how clean its surfaces are, and whether any unusual feature can be independently verified. The most valuable lesson is that rarity is not always about how few coins were originally minted. Sometimes it is about how few survive with the precise combination of authenticity, grade, preservation, variety, and visual appeal that collectors are willing to compete for. Half a century after Americans first carried these coins to celebrate 200 years of national history, the Bicentennial Quarter remains a remarkable reminder that even an object created for everyday commerce can become a serious piece of numismatic history when the right survivor is found.